So we were up talking late last night, and I was trying to get a sense of what would be the most useful thing to do. And the way I understand my job that I've been given is to sort of tell you a story about how realism, a certain kind of realism about universals, has been argued about, debated about within analytic philosophy, and also the ways in which Christians in philosophy, how their fortunes have fared over this same period. And if we get there, we can talk about some issues that any theists are going to be interested in, having to do with realism and theism. How do you put the two together? The goal here, I take it, is I'm providing a sort of advertisement. A kind of advertisement for thinking that this movement, you could call it, I don't know what to call it really, analytic philosophy, is something that is worth looking at as a place to find tools, models, ways to understand one's own philosophical tradition, even if when you initially bump into analytic philosophy, it seems hostile, it seems not to be very useful. And it's up to Sheikh Brown to tell you exactly how to do this from your tradition, and where to look for the best conversation partners, and what to avoid, and so on. I can't tell you that. And if I tried to, you shouldn't listen to me. What I can tell you is this is the experience of Christian philosophers who have had a very rough relationship with analytic philosophy. It was okay, then it was horrible, and then it got a little better, and now it's actually extremely friendly. Very, we're like, we're humming along just fine. And so, as he says, Tim Crane or Jaegwon Kim, they may have no sympathy for religion, really.
David
Chalmers. There's also a difference in generation. So there's an older generation who not only are they not believers in God themselves, but they think that we should be done with that. A younger generation, so Jaegwon Kim was one of my teachers. He was on my dissertation committee, and Bill Alston, who's a famous Christian philosopher, had come to campus, and I was talking with Jaegwon. We were just walking on the quad and talking about Alston's new project, Perceiving God. So there's a very important book called Perceiving God. And Alston's arguing that, it's perfectly possible that you have certain experiences, some people may have certain experiences that just justify their belief in God, and that's it. They've got no reason not to trust them. And Jaegwon, we're walking, and he kind of shakes his head and he says, he shouldn't be doing that. I thought, what a strange thing to say. He shouldn't be doing that? And Jaegwon is the nicest man. He was the nicest man. He's passed away, sadly. But so nice. But in that little phrase, you could tell there's just a little bit of, you shouldn't be, we're not going to go back there. David Chalmers, however, is a younger man, young man, really young, because he's exactly my age, right? I still think of him as very young. And he grew up in a different world. And for him, it's like, yeah, well, there's some people, they have this thing where they believe in God, and God bless them, and do what they do. It's different. There's fewer people who grew up in a setting where religion and secular learning were in a battle to the death. Now you still have people. You've got your new atheist types, and some of them are philosophers. Daniel Dennett, for instance, who do still think we should be in this battle to the death to defeat anybody who believes in God. Religion's all bad. It has nothing but bad effects on the intellect and on society. Okay, so there's a few of those, but they're not the norm within philosophy. So I'm going to tell you. Sorry, every time I do that, I'm probably. I'll tell you a story about the experience of Christians within analytic philosophy. And I came up with this incredibly clever diagram. So I have to use it. And then, you can make of this what you will. But this is what I think I'm speaking for the pretty broad swath of Christians and their experience with analytic philosophy, including Catholics and Protestants of all sorts. So, you've got the story about the you got the story about the elephant, right? And so you got to think of time as going this way. This is the past. This is the future. Analytic philosophy is the elephant. Okay. Now, like the old story goes, if you're blind and you wander into an elephant, you're going to get a really different impression depending upon where you bump into the elephant, right? And in this case, when you bump into the elephant, what part you hit. This is a strange elephant because the way I'm going to draw things, this is about 1935, and this is about 1950 or so. And the elephant has a really long tail going back to about to before 1900, 1890 something. And it's also got a really long trunk because we're here in 2020, and this thing that's called analytic philosophy is still going on. So, but the reason I drew it this way is because this period here was a period when it was very difficult to be a Christian. I can't imagine what it would have liked to have been a Muslim in analytic philosophy. Now, analytic philosophy was a phenomenon that sort of emerged in Cambridge, Oxford, the UK, and in the US as well, more or less simultaneously back here. So it's English-speaking universities. There's a few Christians in here, but these universities are very secular. But there are some Christians operating in this area. who were part of the original founders of analytic philosophy. The metaphor here is supposed to be, during this period, if you bumped into analytic philosophy, you discovered that it was very supple. You could move it around. It could take different shapes. Same here. During this period, to take our topic for today, realism about universals. Every position about universals, they're out there in some kind of abstract realm outside of space and time, and everything is the way it is because they're related to those things. Very popular view during this period. Okay, if you thought, there's no place like that. There's just physical things. They resemble one another, and that's all there is to universals. Nominalist, kind of nominalism, extreme nominalism. You can find that during this period, and everything in between. Very different kinds of theories of universals could be held during this period, defended respectably. Okay. The same is true for all kinds of ancient debates in philosophy that go back to the early modern period, the medieval period, and to Plato and Aristotle ultimately. You find people defending. Lots of people believed in a kind of dualism of the person and the physical world, whatever that's like. There were people who were materialists. There were people who believed in sense data. Sense data were very popular during this period. Sense data were supposed to be, light hits your eyes, and your brain does something, and boom, there are these colors that have shapes and so on. They're not out there in physical space, but they're real. And when you see objects, it's because those things are caused. They're not identical with your brain or any part of your brain, but they're sort of non-physical things that you experience. On the other hand, you had materialists who said, no, where are those things? Why do we believe in them? That experience of red or that smell that you smell, these qualia, are just processes in the brain. They're physical processes in the brain. So you have materialism, you have a kind of dualism about sensory properties. What else do you have? You have people arguing about necessity and possibility, modality. You have people talking about essences. You have people talking about all sorts of stuff. Who founded this? We've got just prior to this, but important, is still alive and going on through here. You've got Frege. Frege makes great advances in logic, and nobody can deny that. It's just, this is really important. And in mathematical logic and the foundations of mathematics. And he believes in abstract realm that's far, it's just somehow we're related to it. We're able to see stuff there when we understand things about numbers and universals and so on. And you've got Bertrand Russell, and you've got G.E. Moore. I get the espressos woke me up, but they didn't help my writing. These are the founders, and then you've got this problematic character, Wittgenstein, who we'll come back to, because he is making contributions to logic, and Russell thinks he's a great help, and then he turns into a problem. So why is this called analytic philosophy? Well, just prior to this, you have British idealism. British idealism, you've got the big B's, Bradley, Bosanquet, and isn't there a, well, I can't remember. We can't remember them because they're screened off by Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, who put a stake in the heart of British idealism. But British idealism was a very, it dominated the universities. It was influenced by Hegel, but it was its own thing. It wasn't just warmed over Hegel. It was its own thing. And one of the big doctrines among these idealists was the unity of the fact, and the idea that there's one big fact, which describes everything. Bradley had this famous regress argument, which you may have bumped into. For a thing to have a property, it's got to be related to that property. So there's got to be this further relation of exemplification that holds between the thing and the property. And for that to really connect the thing to the property, it has to be exemplified by the thing. And for that to really, and so on. So you get this infinite regress of exemplification. And he said, that's vicious. That shows that it's impossible to break things down into a thing and a property or universal that it has. You just can't do it. It can't be done. So that whole picture, very traditional picture of it's sort of how logic gets going. You distinguish between, there are some F's that are G's. You've got the things, and they're F, they have a property, and maybe they also have G. And it says that whole thing is kind of a mistake. You can't analyze a proposition. So a proposition is just anything that can be true or false. Also, all these people believed in propositions as that's the object of thought, and they're non-linguistic. So like you read the early Russell, he says, there's a really good paper which, if this was going to be a semester-long class, we'd read Russell's paper from 1910 on the universal and the particular. And he says, I'm gonna talk about verbs and substantives, but what I mean is not verbs, but the thing in the world that corresponds to a verb. And that's a property or a universal. It's not linguistic, and substantives are not words, nouns. They're the thing in the world that you mean by a noun. And these guys were perfectly clear that this is not language-dependent stuff. So you can speak any language you want, and you can articulate the same propositions. So the propositions can't be linguistic. Okay. Anyway, you have these idealists saying you can't analyze a fact, which is to say a proposition, into parts because, well, a bunch of different reasons, but that regress was supposed to be one of them. And it's like you can't even get started thinking about what this proposition is really about. What is the subject of it? What's being predicated or attributed to the thing? You can't analyze it. These guys said, wait, why? Why can't you? And they just criticized these arguments that were given by the British idealists, and the arguments were genuinely bad arguments, I think. Okay. So their philosophy, their little movement, this little movement started in Cambridge, but really it's connected up with realism, the new realism in the US as well, came to be called the philosophy of analysis. Just contrasted with the idealists who said, you can't analyze anything. Okay. So that's why it's called analytic philosophy. It's just kind of an accident of history that was the important thing. There's a lot of continuity with earlier stuff. Franz Brentano and Meinong influenced Russell and Moore a great deal, and you find them talking about Brentano and Meinong. Brentano and Meinong, terrific philosophers. And these guys say, we are interested in what those guys said. Russell wrote some really long essays where he lists a whole bunch of doctrines that Meinong holds, and he says, I think he's right about all these things, but I'm going to take issue with this or that. So there's continuity, but there's also some major changes, and one of them is logic. So the new logic really makes advances, and it sets in motion mathematical logic, which is its own enterprise, and which you just, if you're going to understand the analytic philosophy, you have to get a sense of what these changes were in logic. But they're really formal changes. So when Christians bumped into this stuff here, you had people like G.F. Stout, who was one of the founders of psychology, but he was a philosopher. H.H. Price, an early analytic philosopher. Who else do we have back here? A.C. Ewing. There's a number of them. Not a whole lot, but those guys were main figures. They were important figures. They had no problem operating in this sphere because it was very flexible. You could articulate views of all different kinds and be taken seriously. Everything changes right around here when 1935 is when Carnap publishes a little book that kind of summarizes his, what's it called, the Aufbau, the logical structure of the world, or something like that. Carnap, and then in 1936, you have A.J. Ayer, who had gone over to Austria, studied with the Vienna Circle, which included Carnap and Schlick and other people. Moritz Schlick, yeah. Maybe Neurath and Weissman. Ayer comes back with the, he comes down from the mountain with the news that we have this verification principle. And so this is the birth of logical positivism. The verification principle of meaning. We're going to make all of philosophy scientific. We're going to do that by taking the sciences really seriously, and we're going to claim that in order for a sentence to even have any meaning, there has to be a way to conclusively verify it by, and then it's a little bit unclear here, immediate sense perception or some kind of measurement, some kind of empirical measurement. And they wield this criterion like a scythe, and everything goes down. All the traditional positions in metaphysics are declared meaningless. Theism itself is declared meaningless. This movement was incredibly powerful. It seemed at one blow to get rid of all the nagging problems and to leave philosophy with the job of just logic and tidying up the sciences. The logic of the sciences is all that really is left for philosophy to do. Thank goodness. Thank goodness we got rid of all that metaphysics. Also morality, objective morality, moral truths. They're not truths. They're, because you can't verify them by sense experience. Moral truths go away, and you have theories of morality that say, well, we use these words and we're just expressing disapproval and so on. So all this stuff is just in one sweep, declared meaningless. Now, of course, there's lots of people who are not logical positivists who are still going. I mean, all these guys are still alive and still doing important philosophy, right? But they're not as influential. And they spend a lot of their time criticizing logical positivism. So they're doing all this work to try to show that this movement got off on the wrong foot. It got off so much on the wrong foot that even as they articulated it, they were concerned about the status of this verification principle of meaning. What is it? You know, is it a truth? Then how do you verify it? I mean, what sense experience is going to show you that? Well, it's okay. We'll work this out, right? They don't work it out. And by the time you get to around here, logical positivism is not really a thing anymore. You have people trying to keep as much metaphysics out as you can. Let's focus on the sciences, blah, 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 make things as unmysterious as possible. But nobody thinks that logical positivism is the way to do philosophy. If you were a Christian in the academy trying to do philosophy during this period, you run up into the elephant and it's just a wall. You can't do anything with it. The views that you want to articulate just can't be articulated. I mean, Christian philosophers throughout the history of the religion have had all different kinds of views about stuff, but none of them could get anywhere with this. And some people who had religious sympathies would try to make some headway, and it was a mistake. So you get people like, Hare, R.M. Hare, famous ethicist. Braithwaite, I think, had some religious sympathies. You had people who tried to take some religious claim, like God exists, and make it into something that the positivists would recognize as okay. And what you got was just ridiculous stuff, you know. So what does it mean to say God exists? When I say God exists, that means I have a positive view of how the world is going to go, or something like that. No, that's not what you mean. And you just look silly for saying that. You can't engage with logical positivism and articulate your view. And when you try to do it, it just doesn't work. So, and this is where you need advice. Not from me, because I can't tell you which philosophical movements are most useful and flexible and can be used to articulate positions that you want to articulate. But I can tell you the experience of Christians in analytic philosophy. This was bad. This was a dark time. And if you tried to just take on board the best philosophy of that period, it distorted your own convictions and the convictions of your tradition. So that was bad. Okay, what happened here? The ear. So what happens with the ear? Okay, here's in my story, the blind person wanders up to the ear, and the ear is sort of flapping, and they feel the breeze, and then they touch it, and they go, "Oh, philosophy, analytic philosophy. I know what it is. It's a big fan. It's a fan that blows away problems. So all the philosophical problems, they just go away if you look at them in the right way." Okay, so some of you have guessed who the fan is. So the fan is Wittgenstein. And this is the later Wittgenstein, who was an extremely charismatic figure and had many disciples who carried on his methods. But he was driven by an idea that was, the Vienna Circle thought of him as a friend initially because they were both driven by the idea that philosophical problems have to be pseudo-problems. People have been mulling this stuff over forever. They can't settle it. So there must be something defective about the problems themselves. Now, mind you, these are the problems that Christians, Muslims, philosophers of atheist philosophers in the early modern period, Christian philosophers in the early modern period, and all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, they've been mulling over these problems forever. These guys in this little period here think because they weren't able to resolve them to everybody's satisfaction, they should be made to go away. Right? And that's the thing that they had in common with Wittgenstein, and it made him seem like a friend. But he really had a very different approach than the positivists. It was much more piecemeal. You don't just develop a doctrine and then wipe everything out with the doctrine. You focus on language, focus on the way we use language, and you say, the way we use language, that's the way, that's what language means anyway. And we use the same words to mean different things, or we use the same words in different ways, in different contexts. And it was a kind of therapy for philosophers. I mean, and Wittgenstein describes it in precisely those words in some of his notebooks and stuff, that this is only useful to philosophers because they've gotten themselves all tied up in knots over what are universals, and what are propositions and where are they, and what are numbers and where are they. So you've got yourself in this bind. Just think about how we use number words. Think about how we use words for universals like redness and goodness and blah, blah, blah. And if you just focus on the way we use words, eventually you'll have this feeling of, I just don't see a problem there anymore. So that was a sort of a gentler getting rid of all the problems. And there were Christians who were attracted to this as well. Bosma, who was an American, Anscombe and Geach, very important figures who were influenced by Wittgenstein, but not ruined by Wittgenstein.
They're buried right next to him.
Are they? Well, they loved him.
At the little bad Christians chapel outside Cambridge.
Well, it makes sense. They loved him, and he was not unsympathetic towards religion. I mean, he was deeply religious, very conflicted about it. I finally read Ray Monk's big, fat biography of Wittgenstein. And, in the middle of his life, when he's developing his later philosophy, he's talking about, writing to himself, Jesus Christ cannot be decaying in the ground because then he could be of no help to us, and he underlines help. Now, who knows what he meant by that? Because, I think when he thought, I have no idea what he meant by that. But you had people who had religious inclinations encountering Wittgensteinian philosophy and then trying to figure out how to articulate religious views that they had without seeming to get into problematic metaphysical puzzles or problems. Some of that is interesting. Some of it is just, it's kind of like that attempt that some religious people tried to make positivism compatible with their faith. So,
isn't there a resurgence of Wittgensteinian or theological discourse that is heavily drawing on Wittgenstein in the 1970s?
Yes.
In the UK?
Yes. So Wittgenstein never goes away outside of analytic philosophy. I mean, inside analytic philosophy, Wittgenstein's influence just drops off massively. Now, not as a thinker, right? He's the Tractatus, which is what he wrote way back here, is a very interesting book. We realize now it goes all mystical in the end, and that's where he was headed. But and his aphorisms, his approach to philosophical problems, because he focuses so closely on how do we actually use these words, it can be incredibly useful. So my teacher, Rod Chisholm, who comes in around, he gets his PhD around 1940.
Was that at South Bend?
Something. No, Brown. I was at Brown. So he got his PhD at Harvard. Quine was in his first year or two as a young professor at Harvard. So Quine and Chisholm are about the same generation. Chisholm had no sympathy for Wittgenstein's philosophy, but he would often start a class with a Wittgensteinian aphorism. So for instance, Wittgenstein says, "What makes my idea of him an idea about him?" That's a good way to start a puzzle about reference. How do we manage? We're over here. Our minds are over here, or maybe not anywhere, and yet somehow we manage to reach out and get him rather than his brother. How does that happen? I might not know his name. I might have forgotten where I met him, but yet I can still think about him. So Chisholm would start out with aphorisms from Wittgenstein. There's a lot of value there, but his influence in philosophy was to try to make all problems go away by thinking about language in an unsystematic way. And in principle, unsystematic. Okay. So Wittgenstein remains very influential outside of philosophy, in theology, for instance. But within philosophy, not so much. And I should say Anscombe and Geach, if you read them, you're not going to think, oh, these guys are Wittgensteinians. I mean, you can see some influence there, but they were their own thing. They were Catholics. They were philosophers who were very engaged with the tradition going back to Aristotle, right? And Aquinas and so on. So they had a kind of a some kind of foundation or scaffolding that they were standing on that kind of held them up, that kept them from sinking into the Wittgensteinian mud. But they got a lot out of Wittgenstein, but they didn't turn into Wittgensteinians. Okay, what other outrageous claims am I going to make? Could I paint with a broader brush? I've got this elephant. So what happens then is, a lot of the people who were Christians in philosophy just said, forget it. We can't deal with this elephant. If you bumped into this elephant during these years, you would think it's hopeless. All these people think either they're just science worshipers who won't let us even articulate theism, let alone traditional problems of metaphysics and ethics and so on. Or else they're just trying to solve all problems by looking at language and analyzing language and claiming that all the major metaphysical positions are due to confusions about the way we use words. So if you bumped into that and you're trying to, even if you're not like, I'm a Thomist or I'm a Berkeleyan idealist or whatever, even if you don't have a specific kind of religious philosophical movement that you're aligned with, if you're any kind of traditional Christian, you bump into this and you think, I just can't. There's no air in the room. So you had many people who were interested in philosophy who were Christians just turning away from analytic philosophy and going to continental figures or to Whitehead for some reason. Whitehead was involved in the, if this goes out on the internet, I don't know. But
I've already done it.
that's how quickly this happens. So Whitehead helps to revolutionize logic, but then he goes off and he builds a metaphysical system that is as baroque as anything from the scholastic period. Very unusual, strange. He introduces all his own terminology.
Baroque makes some good music.
They did, and if it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. But it's, let's say, arcane.
And how do you explain this revival that we appear to be seeing? Philip Clayton is at Claremont, so Oscar actually is right next door to him. And it seems that he's been going in a process direction, maybe up with emergence.
Yeah, so Whitehead's metaphysics was all about process and not about discrete substances with attributes. And somehow you recover all the, everything that's true about the world by talking about processes and more abstruse things, actual occasions. I don't know, help me out. What are some of the other Whiteheadian things? Actual occasions, concrescence. That's a thing. Putrescence? No, that's not. He introduces a whole bunch of technical terms that you have to sort of you have to read this whole thing, process and reality, all at once really fast, and then maybe you can get in the swing of it. Okay, and people do. They sort of absorb it and feel like, okay, now I know how this works. It's a metaphysical systems, and this is how metaphysical systems work. They link everything together, and if you get inside of it, you might be able to kind of figure out how it's supposed to work. And he has a very original one, and it's impressive. And he's an impressive logician, an impressive thinker. And so you never have a world through this period without some process philosophers. There's process philosophers always. But by the time you get into here, it's just a tiny, tiny number. And now, if you were to establish a chair in process philosophy at a major university, it would be very hard to find any philosopher doing it. But in seminaries and in divinity schools and that kind of setting, process philosophy became influential because in this period, it looked like you can't deal with ordinary philosophers, the ordinary philosophers that are dominating the English-speaking universities. Who are you going to deal with? Let's see, that guy, Whitehead. I mean, he's not really a theist in any kind of ordinary sense. He's not a religious person, but he's got a metaphysics that has room in it for something that kind of looks like God, kind of. So maybe if we fiddle with it a little bit, if we finesse it, we can fit God in there, and that'll be better than dealing with these people. So that's why process philosophy became really significant in Christian circles and in Catholic circles, where you'd think, why are Catholics jumping on board process philosophy? It was just invented a few years ago by this guy. They have this tradition that goes back to Aquinas and through all these scholastic figures. Why aren't they on board with that? Well, you got two things going on at the same time. There was a revival of Thomism that was supposed to show how St. Thomas really solved all the problems. And if you could just bring St. Thomas up to date, you can fix everything. And we'll have Thomistic this, and we'll have Thomistic that, we'll have Thomistic logic, we'll have Thomistic biology. I don't know. It was really going to be a revolution. And I knew guys who were part of that, and it just fired them up. People like Ralph McInerney, who was my colleague at Notre Dame, years ago. It really excited them, and it petered out around the same time as you had philosophy being very hostile to Christian thought and traditional positions. So at that time, you had Catholics and Protestants looking at Whitehead's process philosophy as a way to articulate a view that had some room in it, where you could breathe at least. So I think process thought is, there's always going to be people interested in it because it's a complex, intricate kind of metaphysics. But within analytic philosophy, it's no longer influential in the same way that logical positivism is no longer influential. Although not because anybody thinks they refuted it, but just because it's very baroque and complicated and imposing. It's hard to break into it. Which also means it's ripe for some analytic philosopher to come along and say, I can make sense of it in analytic philosophy terms, because that's a lot of what you find happening in this era here. You have people who are doing analytic philosophy who are recovering positions that were held by medieval thinkers, held by Plato and Aristotle for that matter, positions that were rejected as meaningless during this period. So, what happens? By 1950, let's just think about metaphysics, big issues in metaphysics. By 1950, you can talk about ontology again. So, ontology is, what is there fundamentally? What's the fundamental furniture of the world?
And is Quine responsible for this return?
Quine is largely responsible for this. Quine turned out to be a very behavioristic thinker when it comes to the mind and language. But when it comes to mathematics and how should we figure out what there is in the world, you look at your best science, and that science has a lot of mathematics in it, and you see what would have to be true, what would have to exist in order for this theory to be true. And and that's the traditional ontological question. These guys would say, what fundamentally exists, that's too metaphysical. Carnap would say, there's different languages. According to one language, there are universals. According to another language, there aren't. There's no fact of the matter about which there really are. And Quine is important because he puts a stop to that. He provides a kind of method for trying to figure out what is a theory committed to. The method is translate it into logical form, some kind of logical form where you've got quantifiers that say things like, that this stand for English words like there is, there are, there exists. He said, regiment your language. Tell me what it looks like when you're using quantifiers to represent instead of names. And then I can tell what variables here have to be satisfied by something in order for the theory to be true. And that'll tell me what there has to exist in order for your theory to be true. And that brings ontology back. So you can see, if your theory says there is an x such that x is f, well, there have to be some f's. There's got to be something that satisfies this variable. There's got to be at least one f. So if your theory says there is an x such that x is a prime number, then there's got to be a number. If your theory says it's not the case that there's an x such that x is a prime number, well, then you're not committed to prime numbers. If your theory says if there's an x such that fx, then blah, 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 p, something, well, we don't know yet whether your theory is committed to F's. Because your theory might not say that P is true. So this is just a conditional statement. But anyway, the method was, let's look to logic and the way in which we represent traditional ontological claims. There is, there are, there exists. And forcing you to get precise about how to express your views in this kind of terminology will force you to get clear about your ontological commitments. Okay. So that was his strategy. It was very influential, and it seemed like it brought ontology back. But he didn't want to go too far. So he says, back in the bad old days of metaphysics, you would talk about what's necessary and what's possible. What are the necessary truths? And once you start talking about what's necessary, you're not just talking about things like necessarily all bachelors are male, necessarily all prime numbers are numbers. You're not just talking about kind of things that are analytically true. You can say things like necessarily Dean is a human being. That doesn't seem like it's an analytic truth because it's not part of the meaning of Dean that I'm human. So that seems like it's saying something about me and my essence. And that was going too far for Quine. Quine is like, I can't make sense out of that. Now we're back in bad metaphysics. We're talking about essences, and clearly we're empiricists. We're not going to go there. But
can you back up just a little bit and show us what we call mahal al-shahid from mahal al-niza, right? What is the problem that Quine is identifying once you move to the proposition Dean is necessarily a human being? So we understood the main line that now you're talking about essence. You're not talking about what is analytically extrapolatable from your statement. You're going beyond the statement itself.
yeah.
Just give a little bit more spotlight on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think
or is that all there is to it, that this is not analytically part of the statement? It's not part of the language of the statement. You've gone from Dean to human. The concept of human's not involved in at least the language that we're using when we say Dean.
Yeah.
We're assuming something is over and above what is analytically extrapolated from the statement.
Right. So you have all these, back in the old days, you have all these claims about what's essential to this thing, what's essential to that thing. And they're hard to sort out. There's a lot of debate about them. It'd be nice to get a handle on them. If you've got a good logic, which can show you what the necessary truths are and how they can be derived from things that you can just see have to be true. And then if you've got a truth that can be shown to be true by definition, then it's the definition plus logic is going to tell you that it's got to be true. So you have a kind of a method for seeing why this has to be necessary, a method for detecting necessities, and a kind of explanation of why they're true, namely that they're definitions, they're identity statements, or they're basic truths of logic, or something that follows from basic truths of logic. So if you were anxious about these hard to adjudicate metaphysical claims about what's essential to this, what's essential to that, you would, like Quine, want to banish things that claims about what's necessary that you couldn't show to be analytic or logical truths. And something like Dean is human is like that. And so Quine, basically
Is it possibly solved if you compound your sentences and you say Dean is a person, right? All persons are human. So Dean becomes the name that's applied to this entity. And then there's things we know about the entity. Are we still in the same boat?
we're in the same boat, because if I'm not essentially a person, then it could be a necessary truth that if Dean is a person, Dean is essentially human, because person and human are there's an analytic statement there, let's say, although that's not analytic, because aliens could be human, or I mean aliens could be persons, right? So if it's not, but anyway, you're still going to be stuck with Dean, which is just a name. And so there's a kind of a form of necessity claim, like necessarily X is F, that's really problematic, because X is just a variable that stands for something.
Right.
Yeah.
Have we shifted into the question and answer session now, or are we?
It's up to, yeah, I'm happy to do that. Well, let me just do one thing, which is just to say, he threw shade on that kind of necessity, the kind that leads you into essentialism. And he gave arguments that this kind of necessity is bad. And immediately you had people like Ruth Marcus, and I always forget if it's Arthur Smullian or Raymond Smullian. I think Arthur Smullian, a logician, just showing that these were bad arguments instantly. And within a few years, you had Ruth Marcus and Kripke and Plantinga, and then David Lewis. You had all these people doing amazing work in modality, on necessity and possibility, including first advances in modal logic on the part of Marcus and Kripke, and then advances on the metaphysics of it that made room for essences and so on. Okay, and then nowadays you've got every position on the map that you could want to articulate. Dualism, I'm going full bore substance dualism. There's souls, there's bodies, they interact, and I mean nobody's. Not many people are buying it, but actually, there's a new book coming out.
You still have your job.
I still have my job. Well, I got tenure, so. But there's a book coming out from the Cambridge. There's a Cambridge debate series, and there's a book about what are we? And Aaron Siegel is one of the authors, and Eric Olson is the other. Eric Olson defends materialism. Aaron Siegel defends substance dualism of exactly the kind that I like, and he uses the kind of line of argument that I like. So I gladly agreed to write the foreword for it, because he's a young guy who's taking this forward. So yeah, let's we can do whatever you like.
Do you feel like you got to the point where you wanted to? Have you like taken us to where you want to get? We can break any time. But there's not pressure if you've gotten us. If you haven't.
I think I've said enough about this. This is sort of. I mean, I could say more about the kind of more viscerally the experience of Christians now coming into philosophy since the 70s and 80s is just like, oh, this is great. I mean, there's still, there's hostility to religion in the academy. We all know that. I've often had grad students ask me, Do you think I should kind of suppress the extent to which it's obvious that I'm a religious person on my CV when I'm applying for jobs? Is it a mistake to publish in philosophy of religion before I've got a job? Because they're anxious about anti-religious sentiment in the academy. And it's there. I mean, it's real. And a hiring committee might include somebody who just says, no, like Jagwan. Jagwan would never say not to hire somebody. But, he was the sweetest guy in the world. He would never say, oh, we don't want to hire so-and-so because he's religious. No. I mean, he had super respect for Bill Alston when he said he shouldn't be doing that. But you get people who are more hostile, and they're on a search committee, and they're going to go, we just don't want one of them here. That could happen. But this is the other thing that I tell them. There's going to be just as many or more search committees where if your dissertation is on the later Wittgenstein, there could be somebody on that committee who looks at it and goes, oh, we don't want one of them here. Seriously.
That's more likely than...
That's more likely. I don't know about more likely, but it's... I mean, there's a rumor that at a Rutgers faculty meeting, we took a vote on who the worst influence was on 20th century philosophy, and we voted unanimously that Wittgenstein was the worst influence. Okay. This is not true. This is not true. But there was a faculty meeting where I think Jerry Fodor said something like that, and the rest of us probably nodded along. So there's.
So you guys had Stitch and Fodor, or have Stitch and Fodor?
Jerry's passed away.
Okay.
But yeah, Steve's still around. At that time, we had Stitch and Fodor and Colin McGinn and.
I saw Colin McGinn was there for a while.
And and Tim Maudlin and John Hawthorne. Okay, that's enough. So that's enough of the elephant and sort of Christian experience in philosophy. And I can't tell you this is the part of analytic philosophy that you should interact with, or that is this is where you should look for inspiration and so on. There's a lot of different parts of it. I leave that to your fearless leaders. But I'm just telling you, this is kind of how we got here, and also why people in other disciplines are going to tell you that analytic philosophy is just about language, or analytic philosophy is positivism. They're going to tell you that because they bumped into it when they were in grad school, and that's what they encountered. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Really done.